While serving dinner in a mansion, the dining maid froze when she recognized the millionaire. It was her husband, who had disappeared in a mountain accident 7 years ago. She couldn't hold back. Sarah Langley's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel of her 15-year-old Honda Civic, watching the towering iron gates of Harris Mansion swing open before her. 7 years, 7 long years, since she'd driven through gates like these, back when Michael was alive and they belonged to this world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Now she was here as the help. The irony wasn't lost on her as she parked between a gleaming Mercedes and a Bentley, her rusted car looking like a wounded bird among eagles. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing down her graying brown hair that she'd pulled back into the same simple bun she'd worn to every catering job for the past 3 years. The lines around her green eyes had deepened since Michael's death. Worry lines, her mother used to call them. Grief lines was more accurate. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, the same pep talk she'd given herself every morning since the funeral. For Mason. The thought of her 14-year-old son waiting at home with his math homework and dreams of following in his father's heroic footsteps gave her the strength to step out of the car. Mason still kept that framed photo of Michael on his nightstand, the one where he was grinning in his climbing gear, looking every bit the adventurous businessman who died saving fellow climbers in a Rocky Mountain avalanche. Her boy had no idea how many nights she'd stared at that same photo, wondering how their perfect life had crumbled so completely in just one terrible afternoon. The white catering uniform felt stiff against her skin as she walked toward the service entrance, her sensible black shoes clicking against the pristine driveway. Barbara Chen, her contact from Elite Events, had been a godsend when she'd called 3 days ago. "Sarah, honey, I've got something special for you," Barbara had said in her perpetually cheerful voice. "Big charity dinner at the Harris Mansion. You know, Walter Harris? The real estate mogul anyway. They're paying double the usual rate, and I specifically requested you because you're so professional with the high-end crowd." Double rate meant Mason could get those new cleats he needed for soccer. And maybe, just maybe, she could finally fix the leak in their apartment's bathroom ceiling. Sarah had learned not to dream too big anymore, but small victories still mattered. The mansion's service entrance led into a kitchen that was larger than her entire apartment. Stainless steel surfaces gleamed under professional lighting, and the staff moved with the choreographed precision of a Broadway show. Sarah had worked enough of these events to know the drill: stay invisible, speak only when spoken to, and remember that she was part of the background, not the story. "You must be Sarah," called out a woman with silver hair pulled into an elegant chignon. "I'm Margaret, the head coordinator. Barbara spoke very highly of you." "Thank you for having me," Sarah replied, slipping automatically into her professional mode. She'd perfected this version of herself over the years. Polite, efficient, forgettable. It was safer that way. Margaret handed her a tray and began explaining the evening's schedule. "Tonight's event is particularly important to Mr. Harris. It's a fundraiser for families affected by mountain climbing accidents. You know, search and rescue operations, support for survivors, that sort of thing." Sarah's hands nearly dropped the tray. Mountain climbing accidents, of all the causes in the world. It had to be that one. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she got whenever someone mentioned mountains or climbing or any of the words that were forever tied to the worst day of her life. "Are you all right, dear?" Margaret's voice seemed to come from far away. "Yes, sorry. It's a cause close to my heart," Sarah managed, forcing a smile. "My husband died in a climbing accident 7 years ago." Margaret's expression softened immediately. "Oh, you poor thing. Well, then you understand how important tonight is. Mr. Harris has very personal reasons for supporting this cause as well." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself moving through the mansion's grand rooms like a ghost revisiting a former life. The marble floors, the oil paintings, the subtle scent of expensive flowers. It all reminded her of the world she'd once inhabited as Michael Hargrove's wife. Back then, she'd been Sarah Hargrove, hosting dinner parties and charity luncheons, discussing wine pairings and vacation homes in Aspen. Now she was Sarah Langley. She'd taken back her maiden name after the funeral, unable to bear the weight of his name without him there to share it. Now she served wine instead of selecting it, cleared plates instead of choosing the menu, smiled politely while invisible instead of commanding attention as the hostess. The main dining room buzzed with conversation as America's business elite gathered around tables that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. Sarah recognized some faces from the society pages: tech moguls, real estate developers, investment bankers. These were Michael's people, or had been once upon a time. She caught fragments of conversations as she moved between tables, mergers and acquisitions, market predictions, children at prestigious boarding schools. It was like listening to a language she'd once spoken fluently but had almost forgotten. The Whitmore deal was brilliant, she heard someone say as she refilled water glasses. David came out of nowhere 5 years ago and just dominated the Atlanta market. Guy's got the Midas touch. Sarah smiled politely and moved on, but something about the name tickled her memory. Whitmore. She'd heard that name recently. Hadn't she? Barbara had mentioned it when going over the guest list. Something about a prominent real estate developer who'd be at the head table. The evening's program began with Mr. Harris taking the podium. Walter Harris was a distinguished man in his late 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold deep sadness. When he spoke about the foundation's mission, his voice carried the weight of personal experience. 7 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the silent room, I learned that sometimes the mountains take more from us than we're prepared to give. Sometimes they take people we thought we couldn't live without, leaving behind families who must find a way to carry on. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. 7 years ago, the same timeline as Michael's accident. She wondered if Mr. Harris had lost someone in the same avalanche, if their tragedies were somehow connected by mountain and timing and the cruel randomness of fate. As the evening wound down and she began collecting empty champagne flutes, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She'd made it through another high-end event without breaking down, without letting the memories of her former life overwhelm her. Tomorrow she'd wake up in her small apartment, help Mason with his homework, and continue the endless cycle of surviving one day at a time. But as she loaded glasses onto her tray near the head table, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened tonight, something just beyond her awareness. The name Whitmore still echoed in her mind. Along with the strange coincidence of Mr. Harris's 7-year timeline, she was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the man approaching her table until he was right there, reaching for one last champagne flute she'd missed. When she looked up to apologize for the oversight, her world stopped completely. The champagne flute slipped from Sarah's fingers as if her hands had forgotten how to hold anything at all. The crystal shattered against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through every corner of the grand dining room. But Sarah barely heard it. She was drowning in a pair of familiar brown eyes that belonged to a dead man. Michael. Her Michael. Standing there in an expensive charcoal suit, his hair slightly grayer at the temples, his jawline sharper than she remembered, but unmistakably him. The same crooked smile that used to make her heart skip, the same way of tilting his head when he was surprised, the same small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd told her about on their 3rd date. But this couldn't be Michael. Michael was dead. She'd buried him 7 years ago in Riverside Cemetery, plot 247C, under a headstone that read, Beloved Husband and Father. She'd thrown dirt on his empty coffin because they never found his body in the avalanche. She'd worn black for a year and cried herself to sleep for 2. Oh my goodness, are you all right? The man, this impossible ghost wearing Michael's face, stepped forward with concern, his voice carrying that same warm baritone that used to whisper good morning against her ear. Let me help you clean this up. Sarah's legs felt like they might give out. Around them, other guests had turned to look at the commotion, their conversations pausing as servers rushed over with napkins and a small dustpan. Through the buzzing in her ears, she heard someone introduce the man as David Whitmore, successful real estate developer from Atlanta, generous donor to the foundation. David Whitmore, not Michael Hargrove, but those eyes, that voice, the way he unconsciously touched his wedding ring with his thumb when he was nervous, a habit she'd noticed during their engagement and never forgotten. I'm so sorry, Sarah managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. I'll clean it up. I'll pay for the glass, Nonsense, David Whitmore said gently, and when he smiled, Sarah's world tilted completely off its axis. It was Michael's smile, not similar, not reminiscent. It was exactly, precisely, impossibly Michael's smile. Accidents happen. Are you hurt? You look pale. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at this man who wore her dead husband's face and spoke with her dead husband's voice and had her dead husband's hands. Hands she'd held through 2 years of dating, 6 years of marriage, and one terrible phone call that had destroyed everything. "Sarah," Margaret appeared beside her, professional concern masking what was probably embarrassment at her server's behavior. "Are you feeling unwell?" The sound of her name seemed to jolt David Whitmore. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and she saw something flicker across his features. Recognition. Panic. Fear. It lasted only a fraction of a second before his expression smoothed back into polite concern. But Sarah caught it. She'd seen that exact look on Michael's face the night he'd confessed to losing money in a bad investment, right before he'd promised her everything would be okay. Everything had not been okay. "I need some air," Sarah heard herself say, though she wasn't sure who was speaking. Her voice sounded foreign, distant. "Excuse me?" She turned and walked toward the kitchen with as much dignity as she could muster, feeling David Whitmore's eyes burning into her back with every step. Her hands were shaking so violently that she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself as she pushed through the swinging doors. The kitchen was a blur of activity, but Sarah barely registered the organized chaos around her. She made it to the staff bathroom just in time before her legs gave out completely. Sitting on the small bench inside, she pressed her hands to her face and tried to remember how to breathe. It wasn't possible. Dead people didn't serve themselves champagne at charity dinners. Dead people didn't grow gray at their temples or develop new lines around their eyes. Dead people didn't wear expensive suits and answer to different names and look at their supposedly widowed wives like they'd seen a ghost. But what if they did? The thought crept into her mind like poison, spreading through every rational defense she'd built over 7 years of grief and recovery. What if Michael hadn't died in that avalanche? What if the body they never found was never there to begin with? What if her husband, the father of her son, the love of her life, the man she'd mourned for 7 years, was alive and well and living under another name just a few hundred miles away? Sarah's stomach lurched, and she gripped the edge of the sink as waves of nausea crashed over her. If Michael was alive, then everything she'd believed for 7 years was a lie. Every tear she'd cried, every sleepless night, every moment she'd struggled to explain to Mason why Daddy wasn't coming home, all of it built on a foundation of deception. But if Michael was alive and hadn't come home, hadn't called, hadn't let her know, then he'd chosen to leave them, chosen to let them believe he was dead, chosen to build a new life as David Whitmore. While she worked as a server at the kind of parties they used to host together, a soft knock on the bathroom door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Sarah, honey, it's Barbara. Margaret said you weren't feeling well. Are you okay in there?" Sarah splashed cold water on her face and opened the door, forcing what she hoped was a convincing smile. Barbara stood there with genuine concern written across her kind features. "I'm fine," Sarah lied smoothly. "Just felt dizzy for a moment. Low blood sugar, probably. I forgot to eat dinner before coming tonight." Barbara's expression relaxed. "Oh, you poor thing. There are some crackers in the break area, and I think we have some orange juice. The adrenaline from these big events can really take it out of you." "Thank you. I'll be fine in just a minute." But as Barbara led her toward the break area, chattering about the successful evening and how impressed Mr. Harris had been with the service, Sarah's mind was racing. She needed to see David Whitmore again, needed to confirm what her eyes had told her. Maybe it was just shock and exhaustion playing tricks on her. Maybe she'd been working too hard and missing Michael too much, and her grief had conjured his face onto a stranger. Or maybe her husband had been living a lie for 7 years, and she was about to discover that everything she thought she knew about her life was wrong. Through the small window that looked out onto the main dining room, Sarah caught another glimpse of David Whitmore. He was talking animatedly with other guests. But she noticed how his eyes kept darting toward the kitchen doors, how his hand kept going to that wedding ring, how his smile seemed strained around the edges. In that moment, watching him pretend to be someone else while she hid in the kitchen like a broken servant, Sarah Langley made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she was going to find out exactly who David Whitmore really was, and if he turned out to be Michael Hargrove, her supposedly dead husband, was going to have a lot of explaining to do. 8 years ago, Michael Hargrove had been a man with everything to lose and nowhere to run. The Salazar brothers didn't make idle threats. And when they said they'd take his family if he couldn't pay back the $200,000 he owed them, Michael knew they meant every word. He'd seen what happened to other men who'd borrowed from them. Men who'd thought they could outsmart the system, just like he had. The gambling had started innocently enough. A few poker games with clients, some sports betting to make watching the games more interesting. But Michael had always been competitive, always believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room. When his construction business hit a rough patch, and he needed quick cash to cover payroll, the weekly poker game seemed like an easy solution. He'd lost everything in 3 months. The night he'd come home to find Sarah reading Mason a bedtime story, her voice soft and trusting as she talked about Daddy's important business trip. Michael had stood in the doorway and realized he was about to destroy the only good things in his life. Mason was 7 then, still young enough to believe his father was a hero, still innocent enough to think the world was fair and safe and predictable. Sarah had looked up at him with those green eyes full of love and asked how his day went, and Michael had lied to her face, just like he'd been lying for months. "Good," he'd said, kissing her forehead and pretending his hands weren't shaking. "Everything's going to be fine." But everything was not going to be fine. The Salazars had given him 2 weeks to come up with their money, plus interest that had ballooned the debt to nearly $300,000. Michael's business was hemorrhaging cash. Their savings were gone, and the only asset he had left was his partnership in Harris Development. Specifically, his access to the company's emergency funds. Walter Harris trusted him completely. They'd been partners for 8 years, built the company from nothing into one of Colorado's most successful development firms. Walter treated him like a son, had even named him in his will as a minority stakeholder who would inherit a substantial portion of the business, which made what Michael did next even more unforgivable. He'd started small, telling himself it was just a loan, $100,000 from the emergency account, replaced before anyone noticed. But the Salazars wanted their money immediately, and the hole kept getting deeper. By the time Michael realized what he'd done, he'd stolen over $2 million from the man who'd been like a father to him. The climbing trip to the Rockies had been planned for months. A guy's weekend with his old college friend Justin Green, who worked for Mountain Rescue. It was supposed to be a chance to clear his head, to figure out how to confess everything to Sarah and Walter, and somehow make things right. Instead, it became the perfect opportunity for the most elaborate lie of his life. Justin had been struggling financially too, working a government job that barely covered his ex-wife's alimony payments. When Michael explained his situation, the debt, the theft, the death threats against his family, Justin had listened with the calculating expression of a man who saw opportunity in desperation. "What if you just disappeared?" Justin had asked on their second night in the mountains, whiskey making them both philosophical about impossible solutions. What if Michael Hargrove died up here, and the Salazars had no one left to collect from? The plan they'd hatched that night was insane, desperate, and ultimately successful. Justin would report Michael missing during a solo climb on a particularly dangerous route. They'd plant evidence. Michael's climbing gear damaged in a simulated fall, some of his blood smeared on the rocks. The forecast showed a severe storm system moving in, the kind that could trigger avalanches and make recovery operations impossible. Michael had cut himself with his own knife, watching his blood soak into his torn jacket as Justin positioned it perfectly on a ledge that would be visible to rescue teams, but impossible to reach safely. They'd waited for the storm. Then Justin had hiked out alone and called in the emergency, while Michael stayed hidden in an abandoned mining cabin they'd scouted earlier. For 3 days, Michael had listened to radio reports about the search for his own body, while Sarah's voice, raw with grief and hope, begged him to hold on until rescuers could reach him. He'd heard her tell Mason that Daddy was strong, that he'd find a way to come home, that they just had to keep believing. He'd almost broken then, almost hiked down and confessed everything. But then the radio had announced that the search was being called off due to avalanche danger, and Michael Hargrove was officially presumed dead. The hardest part hadn't been letting Sarah think he was gone. The hardest part had been staying hidden during his own funeral. Watching from a distance through binoculars as his wife and son threw dirt on an empty coffin, Sarah had worn the black dress he'd bought her for their anniversary the year before, and Mason had stood there in his little suit, too young to really understand that Daddy wasn't coming back from this business trip. With the new identity Justin had helped him acquire, birth certificate, social security number, the works. Michael had become David Whitmore and moved to Atlanta to start over. The stolen money, carefully laundered through a series of shell companies, became the seed capital for a real estate empire that had made him legitimately wealthy within 5 years. He'd told himself it was temporary. He'd told himself he'd find a way to make things right, to pay back Walter, to reunite with his family once the danger had passed. But the Salazars had disappeared into whatever hole criminal organizations crawled into when their debtors vanished, and making contact with Sarah would have meant risking exposure. So David Whitmore had continued building his new life, complete with a society marriage to Lauren Davis, whose family connections had opened doors throughout Atlanta's business elite. Lauren was everything Sarah wasn't. Polished where Sarah was natural, calculating where Sarah was genuine, ambitious where Sarah was content. She was the perfect wife for David Whitmore's public image, even if she could never make him forget the woman he'd really loved. For 7 years, he'd convinced himself that Sarah and Mason were better off without him. They'd received his life insurance payout, a substantial amount that should have set them up comfortably. He'd even arranged for anonymous payments to be sent to Sarah monthly, substantial amounts that should have ensured she never had to work as anything but a hobby. What he hadn't known was that Justin Green had been intercepting every payment, depositing the money into his own accounts while Sarah struggled to survive on her grief and pride. The friend who'd helped him disappear had been systematically stealing from the family Michael was trying to protect, and Michael had never known because he'd been too afraid to check up on them directly. Now, standing in his Atlanta mansion with Lauren sleeping upstairs, pregnant with their first child, Michael stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw the face of a stranger. David Whitmore was successful, respected, secure. He had everything Michael Hargrove had lost when the gambling destroyed his first life. But tonight, when Sarah's eyes had met his across that dining room, when recognition had flashed between them like lightning, David Whitmore had crumbled, and Michael Hargrove had stood naked in his expensive suit, exposed and terrified and caught in the biggest lie ever told. Tomorrow, he knew, his carefully constructed world was going to come crashing down. Walter Harris had never forgotten the taste of betrayal, even at 78. Sitting in his study surrounded by 40 years of business achievements, he could still remember the exact moment he'd discovered that $2 million was missing from Harris Development's emergency fund. More than the money, though. He remembered the crushing realization that Michael Hargrove, the young man he'd mentored, trusted, and loved like a son, had stolen it all. The timing had been particularly cruel. Michael's death in the avalanche had occurred just 3 days before Walter's annual audit would have revealed the theft. For months afterward, Walter had convinced himself it was a coincidence, that someone else must have accessed the accounts. He'd even hired security experts to investigate potential cyber attacks or embezzlement by other employees. But the evidence always led back to Michael's access codes, Michael's authorization signatures, Michael's fingerprints on withdrawal slips that dated back nearly 6 months before his supposed death. The man Walter had groomed to eventually take over the company had been systematically robbing him blind while planning his own disappearance. The discovery had nearly destroyed Walter, not just financially, though losing $2 million had come close to bankrupting the company, but emotionally. He'd attended Michael's funeral, comforted Sarah in her grief, and watched Mason cry for his dead father, all while knowing that the man they were mourning was a thief who'd abandoned his family. For years, Walter had wrestled with whether to tell Sarah the truth about her husband's theft. She was struggling to raise Mason alone, working multiple jobs just to keep their small apartment. Part of him wanted to spare her the additional pain of knowing that her beloved husband had been a criminal. Another part of him burned with the injustice of her mourning, a man who'd betrayed everyone who'd ever trusted him. In the end, he'd chosen silence, but not forgiveness. Walter Harris was a patient man who understood that justice sometimes required careful planning. He'd survived the financial hit, rebuilt his company, and waited for the right moment to find the truth about Michael Hargrove's convenient death. That moment had come 2 years ago, when a casual conversation with a client had mentioned an up-and-coming real estate developer in Atlanta named David Whitmore. Something about the description, the man's age, his background in construction, his sudden appearance in the market with substantial capital, had triggered Walter's instincts. Brian Cooper had been recommended by a security firm that specialized in corporate investigations, a former FBI agent with 20 years of experience tracking financial crimes. Brian had the patient, methodical approach that Walter needed. More importantly, he understood that this wasn't just about recovering stolen money. It was about exposing the truth about a man who'd faked his own death and abandoned his family. "I want you to investigate David Whitmore," Walter had told Brian during their first meeting. "Dig into his background, his finances, his personal history. I have reason to believe he might not be who he claims to be." Brian's investigation had started with public records and financial filings, but it quickly became apparent that David Whitmore's history was suspiciously thin. His business registration dated back only 7 years. His credit history began around the same time, and despite his claimed background in construction, there were no records of him working in the industry before arriving in Atlanta. More intriguingly, David Whitmore had appeared in Atlanta with enough capital to make significant real estate investments. But the source of that initial funding was obscured through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. The financial sophistication required to structure such transactions suggested someone with inside knowledge of corporate finance, exactly the kind of knowledge Michael Hargrove had possessed as Walter's partner. The physical evidence had been even more compelling. Through careful surveillance and public appearances, Brian had collected dozens of photographs of David Whitmore. When compared to old photos of Michael Hargrove, the similarities were undeniable. The same bone structure, the same mannerisms, even the same nervous habit of touching his wedding ring when he was thinking. The breakthrough had come when Brian managed to obtain a sample of David Whitmore's DNA from a discarded coffee cup outside his office building. The sample matched DNA that Walter had preserved from Michael's personal effects: hair from his brush, saliva from a water bottle he'd left in the office. The man living as David Whitmore was definitely Michael Hargrove, but knowing the truth and proving it in a way that would hold up in court were two different things. Brian's surveillance evidence was compelling but circumstantial. The DNA sample had been obtained without consent and wouldn't be admissible in legal proceedings. They needed something more, a confession, or at least a public confrontation that would force Michael to reveal himself. That's when Walter had conceived his most elaborate plan. Yet, the foundation dinner hadn't been chosen randomly. Walter had researched every aspect of Michael's new life, including his marriage to Lauren Davis and his integration into Atlanta's social elite. When Walter learned that David Whitmore regularly attended charity events and had a particular interest in causes related to mountain rescue, an interest that made perfect sense given how he'd faked his own mountain climbing death, Walter had seen his opportunity. The guest list for the foundation dinner had been carefully curated. Walter had made sure that David Whitmore received a personal invitation, one that emphasized the importance of supporting families affected by mountain climbing accidents. He'd even included subtle mentions of specific avalanche incidents from 7 years ago, knowing that Michael would recognize the reference to his own supposed death. But the masterstroke had been arranging for Sarah to be at the event. Walter had known Sarah was struggling financially. He'd been quietly monitoring her situation for years, wrestling with guilt over not helping her while simultaneously resenting her for mourning a man who'd betrayed them all. When he'd learned through discreet inquiries that she was working catering jobs to make ends meet, he'd found his perfect test. Barbara Chen had been easy to convince, a generous donation to her catering company, along with a specific request for that wonderful server who worked the Henderson event last month, had been all it took to ensure Sarah's presence at the dinner. Walter had even made sure she was assigned to serve the head table, where David Whitmore would be seated as an honored guest. From his position at the podium during the evening's program, Walter had watched the entire drama unfold. He'd seen the moment Sarah recognized David, witnessed the shock and confusion on both their faces, observed how David's careful composure had cracked just enough to confirm everything Brian's investigation had suggested. The shattered champagne glass had been the perfect punctuation to 7 years of planning. Now, sitting in his study the morning after the dinner, Walter reviewed the photographs Brian had taken during the evening. The images captured every moment of the confrontation. Sarah's face draining of color, David's panicked expression, the careful way he'd avoided looking directly at her for the rest of the evening. "What's our next move?" Brian asked, spreading the photos across Walter's desk like evidence in a trial. Walter studied the images, particularly one that showed Sarah fleeing toward the kitchen, while David stood frozen, his hand pressed to his chest as if he'd been shot. After 7 years of patient investigation, he finally had confirmation that Michael Hargrove was alive and living a lie, but confirmation wasn't enough. Walter wanted justice, and justice required more than photographs and DNA samples. It required the kind of public revelation that would expose Michael's crimes and force him to face the consequences of abandoning his family. "Now we wait," Walter said quietly, touching the framed photo on his desk that showed him and Michael at a company picnic. Back when he'd believed the young man was like a son to him. Sarah knows the truth now, even if she doesn't want to believe it, and Michael knows that his secret is out. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Desperate people make desperate choices, Brian, and desperate choices lead to mistakes. All we have to do is be ready to catch him when he falls. Sarah hadn't slept. She'd driven home from the Harris mansion in a daze, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The babysitter had asked if she was feeling all right. Apparently, she looked like she'd seen a ghost, which was closer to the truth than the teenager could have imagined. Now, 24 hours later, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Mason had left for school with his usual kiss on her cheek and his usual complaints about algebra homework. Completely unaware that his mother's world had shattered and reformed in the space of a single evening, she'd spent the night Googling David Whitmore Atlanta real estate, reading every article, studying every photograph she could find online. The man in the business journal profiles looked successful, confident, established. He lived in a mansion in Buckhead, was married to a woman named Lauren Davis, and had built a real estate empire that was worth millions. He also had Michael's hands, Michael's smile, and Michael's voice. The knock on her apartment door came at exactly 10:30 a.m., just after Mason had left for school. Sarah knew who it would be before she opened it, but seeing him standing there in her dingy hallway, this man who wore her dead husband's face, but dressed in clothes that cost more than her monthly rent, still made her stomach lurch. "Hello, Sarah." His voice was soft, tentative, nothing like the confident businessman she'd seen at the dinner. "May I come in?" She stepped aside wordlessly, watching as he entered her small apartment and took in the secondhand furniture, the water stain on the ceiling, the stack of unpaid bills on her counter. His eyes lingered on Mason's school photos lined up on the refrigerator, and she saw him swallow hard when he noticed how much their son had grown. "You look good," he said finally, which was such an absurd thing to say that Sarah almost laughed. She looked tired and worn down and exactly like what she was, a woman who'd been struggling alone for 7 years, while her supposedly dead husband built a new life with someone else. "Do I?" she asked, her voice coming out sharper than she'd intended. "I look good for a widow who's been working 3 jobs to keep a roof over her son's head, while mourning a husband who apparently decided to play dead instead of coming home. Michael, she couldn't think of him as David, wouldn't give him that dignity, flinched as if she'd slapped him. "Sarah, please, you don't understand. I had to." "You had to what?" The words exploded out of her, 7 years of grief and exhaustion and betrayal finding their voice all at once. "You had to let me plan your funeral. You had to let Mason cry himself to sleep for months because he thought his daddy was never coming home. You had to let me sell our house and move into this place because I couldn't afford the mortgage payments on what I made working at the diner. I sent money," he said desperately. "Every month I sent money. Substantial amounts. You should have been comfortable. You should never have had to work." "What money?" Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Michael, I haven't received a penny from anyone in 7 years except your life insurance payout. And that barely covered the funeral costs and Mason's basic needs." The color drained from his face. "That's impossible. I sent $5,000 every month, sometimes more. I set up the transfers myself. Made sure they were untraceable but reliable. Justin was supposed to..." He stopped, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. Justin Green, your climbing buddy who reported you missing." Sarah's voice was deadly quiet. "The one who spoke at your funeral about what a good friend you were." Michael sank onto her couch, his head in his hands. "He was supposed to make sure you got the money, anonymous payments. Nothing that could be traced back to me, but enough to keep you and Mason comfortable. I trusted him to take care of you." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and each one made Sarah feel sicker. "So not only did you fake your own death and abandon your family, but you were so careless about it that your accomplice robbed us blind while we were grieving you. It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Michael said, looking up at her with eyes that were filled with tears. "Sarah, you have to believe me. I never wanted to hurt you. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" The story that spilled out of him was like something from a movie. Gambling debts, death threats, stolen money from Walter Harris. Sarah listened in growing horror as her husband, her supposedly honorable, hard-working husband, revealed himself to be a thief and a coward who'd chosen the most elaborate lie possible rather than face his problems like a man. "The Salazar brothers would have killed you," he finished desperately. "They would have taken Mason, hurt him to get to me. I couldn't let that happen. Disappearing was the only way to keep you safe." "Safe," Sarah's voice cracked. "Michael, I worked 16-hour days for 3 years just to keep us from getting evicted. Mason wore second-hand clothes and ate generic cereal while you were building a real estate empire in Atlanta. He asked me every night for 2 years why Daddy had to die. And I had to make up stories about how brave and heroic you were because I couldn't bear to see him stop believing in heroes." Michael was crying now. Silent tears that tracked down his cheeks and made him look more like the man she'd married and less like the stranger he'd become. I know I destroyed everything. But Sarah, I love you. I've always loved you. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about you and Mason. Haven't wished I could come home. But you didn't come home," she said simply. "You got married to someone else, while I was still wearing my wedding ring and telling our son bedtime stories about his dead father. Lauren is..." He struggled for words. "It's not real. None of it is real. She's part of the identity, part of the life I had to build to stay hidden. But she's not you. She could never be you." Sarah stared at him. This man who had been the center of her universe for 8 years, and then the source of her deepest pain for 7 more. "Are you telling me that your wife doesn't know who you really are?" "No. No one knows except Justin. And now you." Michael leaned forward desperately. "Sarah, I can fix this. I can make everything right. I have money now. Real money. I can pay back Walter. I can take care of you and Mason. I can..." "What you can do," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart, "is tell the truth. All of it. To Walter, to the police, to Mason. You can stop living this lie and face the consequences of what you did." Michael's face went pale. "I can't do that. If I confess, I'll go to prison. I'll lose everything. The business, the house, Lauren's family connections, and the Salazars might still be out there if they find out I'm alive. Then you should have thought of that before you stole $2 million and faked your own death," Sarah said coldly. "Michael, you destroyed 3 families with your choices, mine and Mason's, Walter's, and now Lauren's, because she's married to a ghost and doesn't even know it." She stood up, needing to put distance between them before the part of her that still loved him. And God help her, there was still a part that loved him, convinced her to forgive the unforgivable. "I want you to leave now," she said quietly. "I need time to think, and Mason will be home from school soon. I won't have him see you like this. Not until I figure out how to explain that his dead father has been alive all along." Michael rose slowly, his movements defeated. "Sarah, please don't tell anyone yet. Give me time to figure out how to make this right." She met his eyes, seeing in them the man she'd fallen in love with and the stranger he'd become. "You had 7 years to make it right, Michael. 7 years while I grieved you and raised our son alone and worked myself into the ground trying to survive." As he reached the door, she called after him one last time. "That life insurance money. I spent most of it on therapy for Mason because he was so traumatized by losing his father. Ironic, isn't it?" The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Sarah alone in her small apartment with the knowledge that would either save her family or destroy what was left of it. She had 24 hours before she had to decide which it would be. Mason Hargrove had always been proud of his last name. At 14, he was old enough to understand that not every kid had a father who died a hero, saving other climbers in an avalanche. When his friends complained about their dads being boring accountants or annoying coaches, Mason would think about the framed newspaper clipping on his bedroom wall that called his father a selfless hero who gave his life attempting to rescue fellow climbers. He'd grown up on stories of Michael Hargrove's bravery, told in his mother's soft voice during bedtime and repeated by family friends who remembered his dad as someone special. Mason had built his entire identity around being the son of a man who'd chosen to help others even when it cost him everything, which is why finding a stranger in his living room talking quietly with his mother made every instinct in his body go on high alert. "Mom!" Mason called out as he dropped his backpack by the door, his soccer cleats clattering against the floor. "I'm home." The man sitting on their second-hand couch turned toward him, and Mason felt something strange twist in his stomach. There was something familiar about the guy's face, something that made Mason think of looking in a mirror, but that was impossible because he'd never seen this man before in his life. "Mason," his mother said, and her voice sounded weird, strained and careful, like she was trying not to cry. "Come sit down, honey, we need to talk." The man stood up as Mason approached, and Mason noticed he was tall, probably around 6 feet, just like Mason had always imagined his father had been. His hair was dark with gray at the temples, and he wore clothes that looked expensive. Definitely not the kind of person who usually visited their small apartment. "Who is this?" Mason asked. But he was looking at his mother, not the stranger. Something was wrong. His mom looked pale and shaky, like she had that time she'd gotten food poisoning and had to miss work for 3 days. "Mason," the man said, and his voice was gentle but somehow familiar in a way that made Mason's skin crawl. My name is Michael. He's your father," Sarah finished quietly, the words dropping into the room like stones into still water. Mason felt the world tilt sideways. "What? No, that's not. My dad is dead. My dad died 7 years ago saving people in the mountains. You're not." He looked back and forth between his mother and this stranger, waiting for someone to tell him this was a joke, a misunderstanding, anything but what it sounded like. "I know this is hard to understand," the man, Michael, said, taking a step closer. "I know you thought I was gone, but you are gone." Mason's voice cracked as it always did when he got upset, making him sound younger than 14. "You died when I was 7. Mom showed me the newspaper articles. We went to your funeral." Michael's face crumpled like Mason had hit him. I know that's what you were told, but it wasn't true. I didn't die, Mason. I had to disappear. I had to let everyone think I was dead because you're a coward," Mason interrupted, the words coming out before he could stop them. He'd heard that word used about deadbeat dads on TV shows, men who ran away from their families instead of taking care of them. But his dad wasn't supposed to be one of those men. His dad was a hero. "Mason, please," Sarah said softly. "Let him explain." But Mason didn't want explanations. He wanted this to not be happening. He wanted to go back to this morning when his biggest problem was the algebra test he hadn't studied for, when his father was still a brave man who'd died trying to save others, when his life made sense. "You let me think you were dead," Mason said, his voice getting louder with each word. "You let Mom work 3 jobs. You let us move into this crappy apartment. You missed my birthday every year for 7 years. The tears he'd been fighting started to fall, and that made him even angrier, because crying made him feel like a little kid, and he wasn't a little kid anymore. He was 14, old enough to understand that the man sitting in their living room wasn't the hero he'd spent his whole life trying to live up to. "You missed my first soccer goal," Mason continued, the words pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. "You missed when I made honor roll. You missed when Tommy's dad taught me how to throw a curveball because you weren't there to do it. You missed everything." Michael was crying now too, and seeing a grown man cry should have made Mason feel sorry for him, but it didn't. It just made him angrier. "I wanted to be there," Michael said through his tears. "Mason, you have to believe me. There wasn't a day that went by that I didn't think about you. Didn't wish I could come home and watch you play soccer and help you with your homework. But I couldn't. I had to stay away to keep you and your mother safe." "Safe from what?" Mason demanded. "What was so dangerous that you had to pretend to be dead? What was worse than leaving your family?" Sarah and Michael exchanged a look that Mason didn't understand, some kind of adult communication that excluded him completely. He hated being excluded, hated being treated like he was too young to handle the truth when he'd been handling the truth of his father's death for 7 years. "There were bad people," Michael said finally. "People who would have hurt you and your mother to get to me. I owed them money, and when I couldn't pay them back, they threatened to take you, to hurt you. Disappearing was the only way to make sure you were safe." Mason processed this information, trying to fit it into everything he thought he knew about his life. "So you stole money? You're a criminal." "It's more complicated than that," Michael said desperately. "I made mistakes, bad choices, but everything I did was to protect you." "Bullshit," Mason said, using the word he'd learned from older kids at school. but never dared say in front of his mother. Sarah didn't even react to the profanity, which told him how serious this situation really was. "You didn't disappear to protect us," Mason continued, his 14-year-old brain working through the logic with devastating clarity. "You disappeared to protect yourself. If you really wanted to keep us safe, you would have told us the truth. You would have let us help you figure it out. You would have acted like we were your family instead of treating us like we were disposable." The word hung in the air between them. Disposable. Mason saw his father flinch like he'd been slapped. And good. Maybe it hurt to hear the truth. Maybe it should hurt. "You have another family now, don't you?" Mason asked, remembering fragments of conversation he'd overheard when his mother thought he wasn't listening. "A wife who doesn't know who you really are. Kids who think you're their real dad. Lauren is pregnant," Michael admitted quietly. "But Mason, that's not real. None of that life is real. You're my son. You're my real family." "No," Mason said firmly, surprised by how strong his own voice sounded. "A real father doesn't abandon his kid and then show up 7 years later expecting forgiveness. A real father doesn't let his son think he's dead while he's off playing house with someone else." He stood up, needing to get away from this man who looked like him, but wasn't anything like the hero he'd imagined. "I don't want to see you again. I don't want to hear your excuses or your explanations or your promises to make things right. You had 7 years to make things right, and instead you made yourself a whole new life. Mason, please." Michael reached out toward him, but Mason stepped back. "Don't touch me. You don't get to touch me. You're not my dad anymore. My dad died in the mountains 7 years ago trying to save people. You're just some guy who shares my DNA." Mason ran to his bedroom and slammed the door, leaving his mother and the stranger who used to be his father sitting in stunned silence. Through the thin walls, he could hear them talking in low voices, probably deciding how to handle the troubled teenager who wasn't grateful enough that his dead father had come back to life. But Mason didn't want his father back. Not like this. Not as a liar and a thief and a coward who'd built his son's entire identity on a foundation of lies. He pulled out the framed photo of his heroic father and stared at it for a long moment before placing it face down in his desk drawer. Heroes didn't abandon their families. Heroes didn't fake their own deaths. Heroes didn't show up 7 years later expecting their sons to be happy about it. His father wasn't a hero after all. He was just a man who'd made selfish choices and convinced himself they were noble. And Mason was going to have to figure out who he was now, that everything he'd believed about himself was a lie. The invitation arrived at David Whitmore's Atlanta office on cream-colored cardstock, with embossed lettering that spoke of old money and established philanthropy. Lauren had been excited when she'd opened it, her pregnancy making her more emotional about charitable causes than usual. "It's from the Harris Foundation," she'd said, holding the invitation like it was made of gold. "They're launching a new initiative for families of missing persons, David. This is exactly the kind of cause we should be supporting, especially with the baby coming." Michael had taken the invitation with hands that barely trembled, reading the elegant script that announced the Hope and Healing Gala, supporting families of the missing and presumed dead. The date was set for exactly 1 week after the charity dinner where Sarah had recognized him. The venue was, once again, Harris Mansion. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Nothing about Walter Harris was ever coincidental now. 7 days later, Michael stood in his walk-in closet selecting a tie, while Lauren applied makeup at her vanity, chattering about the guest list and the foundation's mission. She was 8 months pregnant, glowing with the kind of happiness that came from believing your life was perfect and your husband was exactly who he claimed to be. "I read that Mr. Harris lost someone close to him years ago," Lauren was saying, her voice carrying from the bathroom. "That's why he's so passionate about this cause. Isn't it wonderful when people turn their grief into something positive?" Michael's fingers stilled on his tie. Wonderful wasn't the word he'd use for what Walter Harris was doing. The past week had been torture. Every time his phone rang, every knock on his office door, every unexpected visitor made his heart race with the certainty that his world was about to collapse. Sarah had his number now, literally and figuratively. She could destroy everything with a single phone call to the police, the media, or Lauren. But she hadn't. Not yet. That worried him more than an immediate confession would have. Sarah wasn't cruel, but she wasn't weak either. She was planning something, or someone was planning something for her. and the most likely candidate was Walter Harris, the man whose money he'd stolen and whose trust he'd betrayed. "Are you ready, darling?" Lauren appeared in the doorway of their closet, stunning in a black maternity dress that had probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. "The car will be here in 10 minutes. Michael adjusted his tie one final time and forced a smile. Ready, but he wasn't ready. He'd never be ready to walk back into Walter Harris's mansion, knowing that somewhere in that crowd of Atlanta's elite, Walter was watching and waiting and planning his next move in a game. Michael was only beginning to understand. The drive to the mansion felt like a march to his own execution. Lauren held his hand in the back of their hired car, commenting on the city lights and the other expensive vehicles heading toward the same destination. She had no idea that her husband was sweating through his shirt, or that his hand was trembling in hers. Harris Mansion blazed with light against the night sky, just as it had the week before. But this time, Michael noticed details he'd missed during his panic at the charity dinner. Security cameras positioned at every entrance. Men in dark suits who looked more like bodyguards than waitstaff. Walter Harris hadn't just invited Atlanta's social elite to a fundraiser. He'd created a controlled environment where every moment would be documented. "David Whitmore," a voice called out as they entered the main foyer. "So glad you could make it." Michael turned to see Walter Harris approaching, looking every inch the distinguished philanthropist in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. But when their eyes met, Michael saw something cold and calculating that made his blood freeze. "Mr. Harris," Michael replied, extending his hand with practiced ease. "Thank you for inviting us. This is my wife, Lauren, Mrs. Whitmore," Walter said, taking Lauren's hand with grandfatherly charm. "How lovely to meet you. When are you due?" 6 weeks, Lauren replied, beaming. "We're so excited, and what you're doing with this foundation is just wonderful. I can't imagine what families go through when someone they love simply disappears." Walter's smile never wavered, but Michael caught the slight emphasis on the word disappears. Yes, it's devastating when someone vanishes without a trace, leaves so many questions unanswered, so many wounds that can't heal properly. Michael felt sweat gathering at the base of his neck. Every word Walter spoke seemed to carry a double meaning, a message meant specifically for him. "Of course," Walter continued, still holding Lauren's hand. "Sometimes people aren't really gone at all. Sometimes they're just hiding, living new lives under new names, thinking they've escaped the consequences of their choices." Lauren laughed, completely missing the undercurrent of menace in Walter's words. "That sounds like something from a movie, although I suppose it happens in real life too. More often than you might think," Walter said, finally releasing her hand and turning his full attention to Michael. "In fact, I've been working with a private investigator who specializes in finding people who don't want to be found. Fascinating work. He's here tonight, actually. Brian Cooper. Perhaps you'd like to meet him, David." The trap was closing, and Michael could feel the walls of his carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. "I'm sure he's very skilled at what he does," he managed to say. "Oh, he is. 7 years of investigation. And he's finally ready to present his findings. We're planning a little presentation later this evening, a case study in how patient detective work can uncover even the most elaborate deceptions." Michael's mouth went dry. A case study about a man who faked his own death to escape his debts and responsibilities, Walter said, his voice carrying clearly to the small group of guests who had gathered around them. "Stole millions from his business partner, abandoned his wife and child, and built a new identity in another city. Quite a story, really. The kind of thing that makes you question how well you really know the people around you." Lauren's face had gone pale. "That's horrible. How could someone do that to their own family? Desperation makes people do terrible things," Walter replied, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. "But truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Justice may be slow, Mrs. Whitmore, but it always arrives." Before Michael could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. A woman and a teenage boy had just arrived, and Michael's heart stopped when he recognized them. Sarah and Mason. Sarah wore a simple black dress that Michael remembered buying for her birthday years ago. She looked nervous but determined, holding Mason's hand as they were greeted by Walter's staff. Mason had grown so much in the 7 years since Michael had seen him that he barely recognized his own son. The boy was tall now, with Michael's dark hair and Sarah's green eyes. and he carried himself with a maturity that made Michael's chest ache with everything he'd missed. Walter said, following Michael's gaze. I believe you'll find tonight's other guests quite illuminating. Mrs. Hargrove and her son Mason. Such a tragic story. Lost her husband in a climbing accident 7 years ago. She's been struggling ever since, raising the boy alone, working multiple jobs just to survive. Lauren gasped. How awful. We should introduce ourselves, offer to help somehow. I think, Walter said with a smile that was pure predator, that you'll have plenty of opportunity to get acquainted. In fact, I believe Mrs. Hargrove has some very interesting things to share about her late husband. Things that might surprise everyone here. Michael watched in horror as Sarah and Mason were escorted toward their group. In moments, his two worlds would collide in the most public way possible. Lauren would meet the wife of the man her husband really was, and Mason would see his father standing there with another woman, pregnant with another man's child. The game Walter had been playing for 7 years was finally reaching its endgame, and Michael realized there was nowhere left to run. Mason had never wanted to come to this event. After the confrontation with his father 3 days ago, he'd retreated into angry silence, refusing to discuss what had happened or what they were going to do about it. But when his mother had received a personal invitation from Walter Harris to attend the Hope and Healing Gala, something in her expression had convinced him that this wasn't optional. We need to see this through, Sarah had told him, her voice carrying a determination he'd rarely heard before. Whatever happens tonight, we need to face it together. Now, standing in the opulent foyer of Harris Mansion, Mason felt like he was wearing a costume that didn't fit. The black suit his mother had borrowed from their neighbor was too big in the shoulders and too short in the arms, making him feel even more out of place among Atlanta's wealthy elite. Everyone around them wore clothes that probably cost more than his family's monthly grocery budget. Mrs. Hargrove. An elderly man approached them with the kind of warm smile that made Mason think of his grandfather. I'm Walter Harris. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Mason watched his mother's face carefully as she shook the man's hand. There was something in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. Like she knew more about why they were here than she'd told him. Mr. Harris, Sarah replied. This is my son, Mason. Mason. Walter Harris's attention focused on him with an intensity that made Mason straighten his shoulders. You've grown into a fine young man. Your father would be very proud. The words hit Mason like a punch to the gut. 3 days ago, he would have smiled at the compliment, would have felt that familiar swell of pride at being connected to his heroic father. Now, the mention of his father just made him angry all over again. My father's dead, Mason said flatly, ignoring his mother's warning look. Has been for 7 years. Walter Harris studied him with sharp eyes that seemed to see more than Mason was comfortable with. Death is a complicated thing, son. Sometimes people die in ways that aren't immediately apparent, and sometimes people who appear to be dead are very much alive. Before Mason could figure out what that meant, Walter was guiding them through the crowd toward a group of people near the main staircase. Mason's attention was caught by a pregnant woman in an expensive black dress who was laughing at something a tall man in a tuxedo had said. The man turned slightly, and Mason's world tilted sideways. It was him, the stranger from their apartment, the man who claimed to be his father, standing there in clothes that probably cost more than Mason's mother made in 6 months, with his arm around a woman who was clearly pregnant with his child. I'd like you to meet some of our other guests, Walter Harris was saying, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. David and Lauren Whitmore. David is quite successful in real estate development here in Atlanta. David Whitmore. The name clicked into place like a puzzle piece. Mason's brain had been trying to fit for 3 days. This was what his father had become. David Whitmore, successful businessman, married to a woman who wasn't his mother, expecting a child who wasn't Mason. The pregnant woman, Lauren, smiled at them with genuine warmth. How lovely to meet you. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your names. Sarah Hargrove, his mother said quietly. And this is my son, Mason. Mason watched his father's face drain of color as their eyes met across the small circle of people. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched until Lauren looked back and forth between them with growing confusion. Hargrove, she repeated. That's an interesting coincidence. My husband was just telling me about a business partner he had years ago with that same last name, before he moved to Atlanta. Mason saw his father's jaw clench, saw the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wife's arm. "Lauren, maybe we should—" "Actually," Mason interrupted, his 14-year-old voice cracking with emotion. "It's not a coincidence at all." His mother grabbed his arm, trying to stop him, but Mason shook her off. He was tired of adults making decisions about his life without telling him what was happening. He was tired of lies and secrets, and people pretending to be someone they weren't. "You see," Mason continued, looking directly at Lauren Whitmore, "your husband isn't David Whitmore. His real name is Michael Hargrove. He's my father, the one who's supposed to be dead." The words dropped into the group like grenades. Lauren's face went white, her hand moving instinctively to her swollen belly. Several other guests who had been eavesdropping on their conversation stopped talking entirely. "That's impossible," Lauren said, but her voice was shaky. "David, tell them that's impossible." Michael, Mason refused to think of him as David, looked like a man who was drowning. "Lauren, I can explain." "Explain what?" Lauren's voice was getting louder, drawing more attention from nearby guests. "Explain why this boy thinks you're his dead father. Explain why you have the same last name as people you've never met before." "Because he's lying," Mason said, his anger giving him courage he didn't know he possessed. "He's been lying to everyone for 7 years. He faked his own death in a mountain climbing accident, stole money from his business partner, and abandoned his family to start over with a new identity." The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the drama unfolding in their midst. Mason could see phones coming out, people starting to record what was happening. Good. Let everyone see what kind of man David Whitmore really was. "He let my mother think she was a widow," Mason continued, his voice carrying across the increasingly silent room. "He let me grow up thinking my father was a hero who died saving other people. He let us struggle and work multiple jobs and live in a crappy apartment while he was building a real estate empire and playing house with you." Lauren was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she stared at her husband. "David, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me this boy is confused or lying or—" "I can't," Michael said quietly, and those 2 words destroyed what was left of his carefully constructed world. "I can't tell you that because it's true, all of it." The admission hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Mason felt a savage satisfaction at seeing his father finally forced to tell the truth, but it was mixed with something else. A deep sadness for the pregnant woman who was learning that her entire marriage was built on lies. Walter Harris stepped forward then, and Mason noticed for the first time that there was another man beside him, someone who'd been taking notes throughout the entire confrontation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walter said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent room, "I'd like you to meet Brian Cooper, private investigator. For the past 2 years, Mr. Cooper has been investigating the case of Michael Hargrove, who stole $2 million from my company and faked his own death to avoid prosecution." Brian Cooper opened a folder and began spreading documents across a nearby table. Financial records showing the theft from Harris Development. DNA evidence proving that David Whitmore and Michael Hargrove are the same person. Documentation of the fraudulent identity creation. Bank records showing how the stolen money was used to fund Mr. Whitmore's real estate investments. Mason watched his father's face as each piece of evidence was presented. Michael looked like a man watching his own execution, powerless to stop what was happening but unable to look away. 7 years, Walter continued, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. 7 years of investigation, and finally, justice. Lauren collapsed into a nearby chair, her hand pressed to her stomach, her face pale with shock. Other guests pulled out their phones, some calling the police, others recording what would undoubtedly become the social scandal of the year, and in the center of it all stood Michael Hargrove, finally exposed as the fraud and coward he'd always been, with nowhere left to run and no more lies left to tell. Mason looked at his father, this stranger who'd shared his DNA but abandoned his responsibilities, and felt something settle into place in his chest. The hero he'd spent 7 years trying to live up to had never existed, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time to stop trying to be the son of a hero and start figuring out who Mason Hargrove really was. The Harris Mansion's grand ballroom had transformed from an elegant charity gala into something resembling a courtroom. The carefully arranged tables of Atlanta's elite had become an amphitheater of judgment. with Michael Hargrove standing at the center like a man facing his own trial. Phone cameras glinted in the chandelier light as guests recorded every moment of what would undoubtedly become the social scandal of the decade. Michael could see the live stream starting, the text messages flying. The social media post that would ensure his destruction was broadcast to the world in real time. Lauren sat in a chair nearby, her face ashen, both hands pressed protectively over her swollen belly. The sight of her, pregnant with his child, innocent of everything except the crime of loving a man who didn't exist, made Michael's chest ache with a guilt so profound it threatened to buckle his knees. "Mr. Hargrove," Brian Cooper said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent 20 years in law enforcement. 7 years ago, you withdrew over $2 million from Harris Development's emergency accounts over a period of 6 months. You then staged your own death in the Rocky Mountains with the help of Justin Green, a mountain rescue worker who has since confessed to his role in the deception. Michael saw several guests gasp at the mention of Justin's confession. His last ally had turned against him, which meant there truly was nowhere left to hide. The money was used to purchase a new identity as David Whitmore and to fund your initial real estate investments in Atlanta, Cooper continued, spreading financial documents across the table like playing cards in a game Michael had already lost. You've built an empire worth approximately $15 million using funds stolen from the man who trusted you like a son. Walter Harris stepped forward, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Michael found the courage to look directly at him. The old man's eyes held no anger, only a deep sadness that was somehow worse than rage would have been. "Michael," Walter said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I taught you everything I knew about business, about integrity, about what it means to be a man. I was prepared to leave you half my company when I died. I loved you like the son I never had." The words hit Michael harder than any accusation of theft or fraud could have. "Walter, you what?" Walter's voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. "You were desperate. You were scared. You thought stealing from me and breaking your family's hearts was the only option." Michael wanted to explain about the Salazar brothers, about the death threats, about how he'd convinced himself that disappearing was the only way to protect Sarah and Mason. But standing here now, seeing Lauren's tears and Mason's accusatory stare and Sarah's exhausted acceptance, all his justifications crumbled to dust. "There's no excuse," Michael said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I did to you, to Sarah, to Mason, there's no excuse for any of it. Tell them," Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting across the ballroom with surprising strength. She stood up from where she'd been sitting beside Mason, her chin raised in a way Michael remembered from their early arguments, when she'd refused to back down from what she believed was right. "Tell everyone exactly what you did, all of it." Michael looked around the room at the faces watching him. Atlanta's business leaders, society wives, young entrepreneurs who'd looked up to David Whitmore's success story. In a few minutes, they'd all know that everything they'd believed about him was a lie. "My name is Michael Hargrove," he began, and even saying his real name felt strange after 7 years of being David Whitmore. 7 years ago, I was a partner in Harris Development in Colorado. I was also married to Sarah Hargrove and had a 7-year-old son named Mason. He saw Lauren flinch at the mention of Sarah's name, saw her realize that her husband had been married before, that she wasn't the love of his life she'd believed herself to be. "I had a gambling problem," Michael continued, forcing himself to meet Walter's eyes. "I'd been hiding it for months, using company funds to cover my losses and pay back illegal loans I'd taken from dangerous people. When they threatened to hurt my family, I made the decision to steal $2 million from Walter's emergency fund and fake my own death." The confession poured out of him like poison being drained from a wound. The elaborate planning, Justin's role in the deception, the planted evidence that had convinced everyone he'd died in an avalanche. He told them about the empty coffin his family had buried, about the 7 years he'd spent building a new life while Sarah struggled as a single mother. "I convinced myself I was protecting them," Michael said, his voice breaking. "I told myself that they were better off without me, that the insurance money would take care of them. I didn't know that Justin was stealing the money I sent, that they were living in poverty while I was getting rich off Walter's stolen funds." Lauren made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. "You were married. You had a family. All this time, you were married to someone else." "I was a widower," Michael said desperately. "In my mind, I was a widower. Michael Hargrove was dead, and David Whitmore was free to start over. I know how that sounds, but it sounds like you're a coward who abandoned his family and committed bigamy," Mason interrupted, his young voice carrying a maturity that made Michael's heart break. "It sounds like you're exactly the kind of man my real father would have despised." The truth of those words hit Michael like a physical blow. The man he'd been before the gambling, before the desperation, before the lies. That man would have been horrified by what he'd become. "You're right," Michael said, looking directly at his son. "The father you thought you had, the man your mother told you stories about, he would have been disgusted by what I did. He would have found another way, would have faced the consequences like a man instead of running away like a coward." Sirens wailed in the distance. Growing closer, someone had called the police, which meant his last few minutes of freedom were ticking away. Michael turned to Lauren, who was crying silently, her whole body shaking. "Lauren, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but you and the baby, you deserved so much better than this." She couldn't even look at him. "Is anything real? Anything at all?" "My love for you is real," Michael said desperately. "Different from what I felt for Sarah, but real. The baby is real. David Whitmore might have been a lie, but my feelings for you..." "Don't," Lauren whispered. "Just don't. I can't even look at you right now." The police burst through the ballroom doors just as Lauren doubled over, her face contorting in pain. For a moment, everyone froze, watching as she gripped the side of her chair and gasped. "The baby," she managed to say. "Something's wrong with the baby." Chaos erupted as paramedics rushed in behind the police officers. Lauren was loaded onto a stretcher while Michael stood frozen, watching his pregnant wife, his pregnant ex-wife, being taken away because the stress of learning the truth about her marriage had triggered early labor. "Michael Hargrove," the lead police officer said, snapping handcuffs around Michael's wrists. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and identity theft," as they read him his rights. Michael caught one last glimpse of Sarah and Mason standing together in the crowd. Sarah's face was unreadable, but Mason was watching everything with the kind of intense focus that reminded Michael of himself at that age. 7 years of lies were finally over, but as the police led him away, Michael realized that the real consequences of his choices were just beginning. The handcuffs felt heavier than Michael had expected, the metal biting into his wrists as the officers guided him through the Harris Mansion's marble foyer. Behind him, the sounds of chaos continued, paramedics shouting medical terms as they stabilized Lauren, guests murmuring in shocked whispers, phones buzzing with the news that would be headlines by morning. But all Michael could focus on was the small figure running toward him, pushing past police officers and concerned adults with the determination of someone who'd finally found his voice. "Dad," the word hit Michael like a physical blow, stopping him in his tracks despite the officers' attempts to keep him moving. Mason broke free from Sarah's restraining hand and ran the final few steps, launching himself at Michael with the kind of desperate hug that had once been as natural as breathing between them. "Mason, no," one of the officers started to say, but something in the boy's expression must have changed his mind. He stepped back, allowing father and son their moment while keeping a careful watch. Michael couldn't hug back, not with his hands cuffed behind him, but he bent his head down to rest against Mason's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his son's hair. Still the same shampoo Sarah had always used. Still carrying the faint smell of grass stains and teenage boy that reminded Michael of everything he'd missed. "I'm sorry," Michael whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "Mason, I'm so sorry for everything, for leaving, for lying, for making you think I was dead, for missing your whole life." Mason was crying now, his 14-year-old body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. "Why did you do it? Why did you leave us?" "Because I was scared," Michael admitted, the truth feeling strange in his mouth after 7 years of carefully constructed lies. "Because I thought I was protecting you. But really, I was just protecting myself, because I was a coward who couldn't face what I'd done." "I missed you," Mason said, his voice muffled against Michael's shoulder. "Every day for 7 years I missed you. I used to dream that you'd come back, that the rescue teams had made a mistake and you were just lost somewhere in the mountains." Michael's chest ached with a pain so sharp it felt like his heart was being carved out with a knife. "I know," I know, and I'm sorry. I would take it all back if I could. I would do everything differently. But you can't, Mason said, pulling back to look at his father with eyes that were far too old for his face. You can't take it back, and now you're going to jail, and I'm going to lose you all over again. Hey, Michael said softly, wishing desperately that he could reach up and wipe away his son's tears. You're not losing me. I'm still your father, even if I'm a terrible one, even if I don't deserve to be. Mr. Hargrove, the lead officer said gently, we need to go. Michael nodded, understanding that this moment, this last embrace with his son, would have to sustain him through whatever came next. Mason, I want you to remember something, okay? None of this is your fault. Not my choices. Not what happened to our family. None of it. You're a good kid. Better than I ever was at your age. Don't go, Mason said desperately, his hands clutching at Michael's jacket. Please don't go. I have to, Michael said, his own tears starting to fall. But maybe someday when you're older, if you want to, maybe you could visit me, write me letters, let me know how you're doing in school, if you make the soccer team, all the things I should have been there for. Mason nodded frantically. Yes, I'll write to you. I'll tell you everything. Sarah appeared beside them then, her face wet with tears, but her expression more peaceful than Michael had seen it in years. She looked like a woman who'd finally put down a burden she'd been carrying for too long. Sarah, Michael said, meeting her eyes over Mason's head. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but take care of him, she finished quietly. Michael, I've been taking care of him for 7 years. I'll keep taking care of him for as long as he needs me to. I know you will. You're a better parent than I ever was. Michael paused, struggling to find words for everything he needed to say. The money from David Whitmore's assets. When they liquidate everything, you and Mason should get some of it. It won't make up for what I stole from your lives, but we don't want your money, Sarah said firmly. We never wanted your money. We wanted you, the real you, not some fantasy version who sent anonymous payments to ease his guilt. Michael nodded, understanding. I love you both. I know that doesn't mean much anymore, but I need you to know that. Everything I did wrong, all the lies I told myself, none of it was because I didn't love you. I loved you so much it terrified me. Love isn't supposed to be terrifying, Sarah said softly. Love is supposed to make you brave enough to face anything. That's what I'm going to teach Mason. The officers were getting impatient, and Michael could see news crews setting up outside the mansion's front doors. Soon his perp walk would be broadcast across the country. The final chapter in the story of David Whitmore's spectacular fall from grace. Mason, he said urgently, promise me something. Promise me you won't let this destroy you. Don't let my mistakes define who you become. You're going to do great things I'll never be able to do, and I want to hear about all of them. I promise, Mason said, finally stepping back but keeping his eyes fixed on his father's face as if he was trying to memorize every detail. I promise I won't be like you. The words should have stung, but instead they filled Michael with something that might have been hope. Good. Be better than me. Be the man I should have been. As the officers began moving him toward the door again, Michael caught sight of Walter Harris standing near the staircase, watching the scene with an expression that was impossible to read. Their eyes met for a moment, and Michael saw something that might have been forgiveness, or at least understanding. Walter, Michael called out. I'm sorry for everything. Walter nodded once, a small gesture that somehow managed to convey both acceptance of the apology and acknowledgement that sorry would never be enough. The front doors of Harris Mansion opened, and Michael was hit by a wall of camera flashes and shouted questions from reporters who'd arrived to cover the story. He kept his head up as they walked him to the police car, refusing to hide from the consequences of his choices. Through the crowd, he caught one last glimpse of Sarah and Mason standing in the mansion's doorway. Sarah had her arm around their son, and they were both watching him go with expressions that were sad but not broken. They would survive this. They would heal and move forward and build something better from the ruins of the lies he'd left behind as the police car pulled away from Harris Mansion. Michael allowed himself one moment to grieve for the life he'd thrown away and the family he'd destroyed. Then he looked forward, toward whatever justice waited for him, and tried to figure out how to become the man his son deserved to call father. 7 years of running were finally over. The real work of redemption was just beginning.